Thank you for coming for this second conference that the Institute is organizing on inequalities.
Good afternoon. Welcome to this second conference on inequalities. In our first conference, we welcomed Mr. Galbraith. Now, for those of you who were not present during that conference, there is a recap of the various presentations and questions that is available outside this room, and if there aren't enough copies, you will find that report on the site of the Institute. Before giving the floor to Tony Atkinson, let me remind you of what it is that we try to do in those conferences. It looks like this issue, this matter of inequalities, is really crucial at European level and at global level. This is crucial for our future. And it's not only a matter of poverty. It's not only a matter of the Agenda 2020. I'm not saying that poverty is not important. What I'm saying is that looking at it under the or from the angle of inequalities is a way of approaching the issue. If you look at things from the angle of poverty, poverty of children, for example, you lose sight of the fact that, okay, there may be an increasing number of people becoming poorer and poorer, but on the other hand, there is an increasing number of people becoming increasingly rich. That is why we have produced this brochure on inequalities, which is one way of looking at those issues I just mentioned. Now, most of us do work on European matters, and this is a European matter. I mean, you may not agree on other things, but quite obviously, lots of people do agree on inequalities. This is something that Mr. Atkinson will go into later. And I think we all agree on the importance of inequalities. I mean, this is not only a matter for Portugal or Greece. I mean, this is also an important matter for countries such as France or Sweden. So I do believe that this is something we have to deal with at European level. So we had with us last time James Galbraith. This time we have with us Tony Atkinson, who will provide you with a historical analysis of inequalities in the OECD countries and in Europe on quite a lengthy period of time. Of course, we don't have the data that would enable us to go back to the 18th century, but and at the end of his presentation, he will also produce a series of recommendations for actions, because that is what is at stake here. Of course, we do want to engage into an analysis, but we also want to draw some concrete conclusions in order to see what we can do concretely about those inequalities.
So we move now for the presentation, and that's a very challenging title, Where is Inequality Headed? And Tony will present his view during around 1 hour, and then we will have the two discussions and then a dynamic debate between you and the speakers. So thank you again for coming.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk about my research. And as you can see from the screen, not just about research that I've done, but also by some of my colleagues. One of my relatives asked me recently, why do I carry on working full-time when I'm past the pension age? And I said, well, of course, we're being told to work longer by our governments and by the Commission and others. But it's also the fact that I have really some very interesting, challenging young students and postdoctoral research fellows with whom it's really a pleasure to go on working. And I'd like to make sure that they get full credit for a lot of what I'm saying is based on joint work that we've done. Now, there's a question in my title, and what I'm going to try and do to answer it is set out on this plan. I think where we're headed is one of the reasons why there is a great deal of concern about inequality. I shall spend quite a lot of time discussing how much inequality there is and what it's been in the past, but I think it's looking to the future that is actually perhaps the issue which gives rise to most concern. That is that if inequality is rising, and if we're concerned about it, then it's the thought that it may carry on into the future, which is what gives us grounds, I think, for real concern and the need for action. And in a sense, it's one of the themes of what I'm saying. The first theme is the question whether we should be pessimistic in the sense of thinking that things are in fact going to get more unequal, or what is the appropriate balance between pessimism and optimism. And perhaps just to reassure you at the beginning, I'm not going to be totally pessimistic. I think there are some grounds for optimism. The second theme which runs through it, and you'll see it later on in the structure of the lecture, is the role of economics and economic analysis. I'm an economist, and trying to use my professional tools to understand and explain and discuss policy. And then that is the third theme, public action. That is, what possible policies can we pursue? Now, when I first started working on inequality back in the 1960s, it wasn't a very popular subject. And I think it hasn't been a very popular subject in mainstream economics. Now, all of a sudden almost, it's become something which is very much in the media and in politics. And on the next slide, I've quoted from the speech which was made by Christine Lagarde as her capacity as head of the IMF to the World Bank and the IMF annual meetings last autumn. And that was a rather surprising speech, and not one I've ever heard made by a head of the IMF, which was saying that one of her three priorities was indeed inequality. Which I said, isn't what usually comes out of the IMF building in Washington. And right on cue, as I was coming in the train yesterday, I picked up the newspaper and I saw that she's at it again. Christine Lagarde in Davos earlier this week said, "Excessive inequality is corrosive to growth. It is corrosive to society. I believe that the economics profession and the policy community have downplayed inequality for too long." And I quote this not just to draw attention to the fact that it is in the public debate, but also because she's very neatly there, I think, brought out two different but related reasons why we may be concerned about inequality. She said it's corrosive for society. That is, the first reason for being concerned is the effect it has on the nature of the society in which we live. That is, that the inequality in the society in itself is something which people are increasingly finding to be unacceptable. And I should just make clear, since it's often a point that's made in debate, that I'm not necessarily saying that we should have no inequality, but that the direction of movement in recent times has been too far in the direction of greater inequality. So I know which way I personally would like to move, that is, towards less inequality, without necessarily, and I won't be pinned down as to saying how far I want to go down to reducing it. But that is an intrinsic reason. It's because of concerns about social justice, concerns about fairness, about the nature of the society we want to live in. But there's a second point she made, which was that it's corrosive for growth. And in the slide, the speech, she's referred to it being bad for macroeconomic stability. Now, that's an instrumental reason. And it's the kind of reason, for example, that in a best-selling book by two English authors, Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, called The Spirit Level, which you may have come across, they argue that inequality is bad because it causes a lot of other social problems like, for example, bad health, crime, obesity, drug taking, lack of democracy, and so on. And that's a different argument. It's an argument that says we don't want inequality to rise because of the consequences it has. And I separate these two because that's a different argument in the sense that it may well be that there are other causes of obesity and crime and so on. And it may be people say, well, actually, we don't think it's due to inequality and therefore we don't need to worry about it. And so I want to make clear that there are two reasons. And the main reason for me, at least, is not, in fact, this instrumental argument. I think it's good to try and stop obesity and to stop crime and so on, but I don't regard that as being the rationale for discussing inequality. Now, what's been happening to inequality? And just to start off by saying some of the reasons why we have at one time been optimistic rather than pessimistic, and go back to the early work of Simon Kuznets in the mid-1950s, when he argued that actually, although inequality may rise during the early stages of industrialization, that as economies modernize, move from being agricultural to being industrial and post-industrial, inequality may rise, but after a while it will begin to fall again. So you'll have a kind of inverse U shape. Inequality goes up and then goes down. So that was a grounds, in some sense, for optimism that we may, looked at from the point of view of 1955, when he was writing, be looking forward to a period when inequality was on the downward part of the curve he described. So I mention him as an example of why there might have been grounds for optimism. I also mention him because his approach embodies the same kind of thing I'm going to try and do this afternoon, which is to combine looking at empirical evidence, with quite a lot of graphs, all be pictures, with looking at theoretical analysis, looking at ways in which economics can be used to try and see how the underlying forces may influence inequality. So both of these are going to appear in the course of what I'm now going to say. Now, Kuznets was optimistic because it certainly looked, when he was writing, as though inequality was falling. And the evidence that he drew on was mostly evidence about what was happening at the top of the income distribution. And this is the first of the slides that I wanted to show you. It's drawn from the World Top Incomes database, which one of my colleagues, Facundo Alvaredo, has put together and is responsible for running. And it shows you the share of the top 1% of the population, their share in total income. It shows you the kind of picture which you may have seen or may indeed have actually held up on posters at the Occupy movements, for example, in Wall Street or in St. Paul's in London. Many of them held up posters with a shape like this, and that was usually taken from these data in the World Top Incomes database. You may also think it's rather hard to discern much what's going on, and in the next slide I referred to it as a kind of economist's Rorschach test, where you can sort of see all sorts of pictures. But I do think there's something which most people agree on, which is that there is broadly a down, then an up. And you can see the down was certainly occurring in the period before Kuznets wrote, which is marked by the vertical line, 1955. And it carried on for a while after that, until roughly the end of the 1970s, beginning of the 1980s. And then, rather than being an up and a down, it now seems to become a down and an up. In fact, it's rather like a V shape. It's a rather sharp turnaround. So the first thing I think one can see from this is why optimism may have become pessimism. We've moved from a time when overall, at least at the very top of the distribution, inequality was going down to one where it's going up. I think one could also see that, up here I'm slightly differing with our chairman, what Philippe said in his introduction, some differences between countries. You'll see the latter part of the graph is quite a spreading out. To begin with, perhaps countries were converging, but for all these countries I've shown, there are about 12 or so countries on there, you can see that after it began to go up again, some went up much more than others. So, for example, in France, it hardly went up. I should perhaps at this point apologise. There are no slides in here showing you Belgium. I apologise. I also know it's safer not to talk about a country when you're there, as it were. There are also problems in constructing the Belgian data, which I could go into as well. But you see that compared, say, to France, on the other extreme is the United States. The United States share has more than doubled in the period since 1980. And indeed, the share of the top income groups in the United States are more or less back where they were before the First World War in 1913. So this is why people are pessimistic. But before we conclude that's where we are, I think we need to take a step back. I think we need to take a step back and make sure it's clear what I'm talking about here and what in fact we're concerned about. So to take a step back, I want to just say a little bit more about what actually we mean by inequality, because obviously inequality means very different things to different people. Even if, as I'm going to hear, one's confining one's attention to economic inequality. So I'm not talking about political inequality or social inequality. I'm talking about inequality in terms of people's resources and access to them. Even with that restriction, there are many things we could look at. For example, you may reasonably say that I'm concerned about inequality of people's opportunities, not about what they actually get, the outcomes. And that's, I think, a very legitimate and easy to defend position. I'm not going to talk about inequality of opportunity because it's actually quite difficult to do that. Although I do think it is related to inequality of outcome, on which I want to look at. So I'm afraid that is not what I'm going to be looking at. Although obviously in questions we can return to it. Nor am I going to, I'm afraid, have time to talk about what I would call horizontal dimensions. And you might have wondered, or some of the audience might have wondered, when I talk about the top 1%, how many of them were men and how many were women? And that's, the answer is that, well, you can probably work out, looking around the world, what the ratios are. I'm afraid I'm not going to explicitly discuss this, although I think it might be an interesting thing to discuss later on. What I'm going to do is to focus on the other questions which I've identified here, and these are the ones marked I've identified here, inequality of what, amongst whom, and which particular part of the income distribution we should be focusing on. And I want to do this just to be clear what it is I'm looking at, because there's often a tendency just to pull together several different kinds of inequality. For example, there's inequality of people's earnings, of individual earnings. And that's probably the thing which is most commonly discussed, to say how much do people earn relative to others, what's the gap between CEOs and people on the shop floor, what's the number of people who are below the minimum wage level, and so on. Now that's clearly a very important part of the story, and in fact I shall spend quite a lot of time talking about it. But of course it's not the only thing that determines a household's living standards. After all, in any particular household, they may be one person, but many households have more than one person. Therefore, they may well have more than one earner. So obviously, it depends not just on what you earn relative to other people, it also depends on what your partner earns, and whether they're in work. It also, well, I perhaps hesitate in this company to suggest that there are other forms of income apart from earnings. That is, there's capital income, income from savings, from interest, from dividends. And of course, a very important part of income for many households is transfers from the state, and equally the other side of the account, the taxes that they pay to the state. So household income may move in a different way from earnings. It may be quite possible, and has happened in the past, that earnings become less unequal, but household incomes don't. Household income inequality does not go up, and I'll give you an example later on. So I'm going to be focusing for the end product, as it were, on household incomes, allowing for taxes, allowing for transfers, allowing for capital income. And as it says here, I'm going to be focusing on household disposable income, and equivalent means that it takes account of how big your household is and allows for differing needs. So that's the first clarification of what I want to talk about. But bearing in mind, these are different ways in which we could look at inequality. And in the same way, we could look at different parts of the distribution. Philippe said in his introduction that clearly it's important to look at the bottom end, to look at whether poverty is rising, whether it's rising, for example, in the result of the crisis. It's important to look at what's happening at the top, and that's more recent interest. It may be falling or it may be rising. But also it's important to look at what's happening overall, and in what follows, I shall, at least to begin with, look particularly at the overall distribution measured by some measure which captures the whole range of incomes, but everyone has some weight in that. And for this purpose, I'm going to use conventionally, following what's done in most official statistical publications, the Gini coefficient of overall inequality, which is a measure of the overall extent of inequality. And I'm going to therefore use that as a convenient summary way of answering the question, what has been happening to overall inequality? So in contrast to looking at the top shares, which is what I showed you before, the next graphs I'm going to show you will relate to this overall inequality. And what I want to look at particularly is, if it has been rising, is this part of a continually rising upward trend, or is it a rise which is going to level off? And that's why I said we're concerned about the future. If we've had a rise and that's the end of it and it's going to level off, then we have high inequality, but we won't have any continually increasing inequality. So asking the question, is it a continuing trend, is, I think, rather important thinking about the future. And then being more optimistic, is it possible after a rise there have been times in the past when there's been a fall? Have there been periods when we've succeeded in reducing inequality? So those are the kind of questions I want to ask about looking at the experience of different countries. I'm going to look at 12 OECD countries. And I should again make clear, I'm afraid, talking explicitly about global inequality. I'm going to look largely at what's happening in rich, advanced countries. Global inequality seems to be very important, but it's a different discussion that we would need to have. But I am going to take a very long perspective and go back 100 years or so, if I can, in those countries. So what I want to ask is what's happened in these 12 countries over the last 100 years. Have there been increases? Have they been contained? Have there been decreases? Now, of course, an increase in itself is not very interesting. It has to be an increase that's big enough to, as it were, make a real difference. Now, how we say define big enough is clearly partly arbitrary. But to give you a feeling for that, I'm going to look at this changes in the Gini coefficient of inequality, and the yardstick I'm going to use is to ask, is the increase more or less than 3 percentage points, where that 3 percentage points corresponds to an increase which it would require a tax increase of 5 percentage points in order to offset that effect from a distributional point of view. So if the market forces made inequality rise by 3 percentage points, a Minister of Finance who wanted to offset that would have to raise tax rates on average by 5 percentage points. I don't think many Ministers of Finance would enjoy having to get up in Parliament and saying 5 percentage points more, please. So I think that will be my 3 percentage point criterion. It's arbitrary, but I think it's fairly clear that that is suggesting a quite significant change. So let's look then at the historical record in more detail. And I hope these graphs can be seen from the back of the room, and I hope not too many people are colourblind, both of which are potential problems. And I do have some hesitations about showing these graphs because I did it once in America, and a member of the audience who wasn't an economist but was a graphic designer said to me afterwards, "Your graphs are just terrible." And I will try and make them more intelligible as I go along. You can see, in fact, when we're looking at it, that the beginning part of the period, we don't know a great deal. So I won't say much about the pre-war period, but you can also see that the period between the two lines marks the Second World War, and that one answer to the question, when have we had periods of reduced inequality, is actually if you compare the period at the end of the 30s with that in the late 1940s. Between those 2 years, the countries I've shown, and I think there are 5 of them, all showed reductions, salient reductions in inequality. Now that's a bit of an unfortunate lesson, obviously. It's clearly also the case that we can't separate out how far that was due to wartime destruction, wartime regulations, and how far it was due to the effect of the war on the post-war programs, where a number of countries, including my own, elected left-wing governments, which then brought in very substantial programs of redistribution. So I think it may be we need to look since 1945, and that's what I want to do in the next 3 slides, which are to take the post-war period and I will do it in groups of countries because obviously it does look, as you can see, like a pretty unintelligible mess on the right-hand side. Beginning with the Nordic countries. Now, there are lots of myths about the Nordic countries. I'm not sure there's anyone here from any of the Denmark, Norway, Sweden and Finland. But what this shows is a number of things, which is first of all that we have this impression of the 1950s and 60s as a kind of golden age where everything was wonderful. We had full employment, we had economies were growing, we had the development of the welfare state. But you can see that at least for 3 of the 4 countries, there was no great reduction in that period in inequality in that 1950s and 60s. There was a reduction in inequality which took place mostly in the 1970s and early 1980s. So that was the period which we'd have to look to see when, as it were, inequality was being reduced. And then, you see, we do have, just as with top income shares, we have a kind of V. After that, inequality in 3 of the 4 countries began to rise, and it rose by more than 3 percentage points in Norway, Sweden, and Finland. It didn't in Denmark. And it may be coincidence, or it may not be, that the 3 I mentioned are all countries that had serious financial crises at the end of the 1980s and beginning of the 1990s. We tend to forget now with recent events, but all 3 countries had a very serious financial crisis, which involved, among other things, nationalization of banks and other things. And you can see that in all 3 of those, overall inequality at that time rose after that period of economic crisis. The final thing you can see is that in the last decade, since 1999, only 1 of these countries has actually had a salient increase in overall inequality. Philip picked out Sweden. You're clearly right to do so. Sweden is the one country where there has been an increase in the last 10 years. So that the increases in the other countries took place, but then they leveled off. So that what I think this brings out is a somewhat more nuanced picture. It's a more complex picture than simply supposing that we're back on a going up path. Now, is that idea that we are largely dominated by Anglo-Saxon countries, the United States? So let's look at now the group of 4 English, well, I have to be careful describing Canada, predominantly English-speaking countries. I get into trouble both with Canada and Ireland by calling them Anglo-Saxon, and they quite rightly object. So it's in brackets for Canada. Now you see here again that overall inequality was fairly flat in the 1950s and 60s, including in the United States, including in the United Kingdom. There was then some reduction in the 1970s and 1980s, early 1980s. You also see then that after that period, from 1980 onwards, in my own country, the United Kingdom, there was a big jump. You can see that the blue squares go up from under 25 to virtually 35. That's 10 percentage points. Remember, my yardstick was 3 percentage points. This is really a big jump. A bigger jump than the United States. One can also see that in the most recent 10 years, we've again had no salient increase in these countries. Now, that may be a bit of a surprise because everyone tells you, Paul Krugman, Joe Stiglitz, that inequality is rising in the United States. This is actually a good example why it does matter to read the footnotes carefully in tables. Because they're right, the headline figure, which the United States Bureau of the Census publish, does indeed show an increase. But if you look at the footnotes, you'll see that this is a measure which is of incomes before tax, so it takes no account of progressive income taxes, and it's a measure which takes no account of what is one of the biggest transfer programs in the United States, which is food stamps. So transfers in kind are missing from this. And if you go then and look in detail at an appendix to their report and look at definition 14, you'll see that when you take account of those things, there's been virtually no change in inequality over the George Bush, Clinton Bush, Obama years. So again, this is a picture which is one of a very sharp, in the case of the United Kingdom, but also big in the United States, increase, which then levels off. And the United Kingdom is more or less where it was 20 years ago in terms of inequality. What about, finally, the final group, Continental Europe? Here, the picture is rather different. It is, in fact, one of a quite significant reduction during the 1950s and 60s from quite high levels. So there was a substantial period then of reduction in inequality, and followed by a rise later on. A rise which is most marked in the case of Germany. And the increase in inequality, recorded inequality, income inequality in Germany, in the last 10 years or so is quite really striking. It's gone up by about 4 percentage points, so about the same as the United States had in its big increase. And of course, it also was accompanied, although I don't show it here, with an increase in the poverty rate in that country too. So that underlines the picture isn't quite as simple as it may look at first sight. Summing it up, there's been a diversity of experience over the post-war period. There have been large increases, salient increases, in quite a lot of countries: Australia, Germany, Finland, Sweden, UK, US, just to name some of them. Those have all had more than 5 percentage point increases. So it's certainly true that measured inequality has risen in at least half, probably more, of the countries I looked at. But the picture is not all pessimistic in the sense that, except for Germany and Sweden, none of these countries have had a continuing rise in inequality in the last 10 years. So for most of those countries, it was a rise which took us to a higher level. In the case of the UK, a much higher level. And the UK moved from being in the middle of the pack to being right near the top of the pack for inequality. But it hasn't been one which has continued to go on rising. And the final reason for being not so gloomy is that there have been peacetime periods when inequality fell. It wasn't just in the wartime that inequality was falling. So what lies behind this? Christine Lagarde said that economics have been neglecting inequality for too long. It's not quite fair to say that. Because in fact, if you open any first-year textbook in economics these days, you will find a discussion of rising earnings inequality as a textbook example of supply and demand at work. In fact, this is an old story which goes back to Jan Tinbergen, who was joint winner of the first Nobel Prize in economics, and a very great man. But he argued long ago that the wage distribution would widen if technology won the race in the sense that it was faster in its increasing its demand for skilled labour than we were increasing the number of people with skills. He saw it as a race between the demand side and the supply side. A race which he saw as being associated with technical change, demanding more and more skills, and education spreading throughout the population as more and more people were going to university and receiving further education. You'll notice I've already equated something which is, I'm sure, for many of you, it probably doesn't sound right, and I'm not sure it is. I've equated skill with education. And those are not clearly the same thing. And that is, I think, an awkwardness about the economist's story, that they tend to assume that people who are at university are acquiring skills. And of course, that is open to question. But that's the story which is told, it's the standard textbook story, a story which since Tinbergen has been augmented because now another driver of the demand side is recognized to be globalization, that it is the effect of world trade, where industries which use skilled labor are more able to compete than those that use unskilled labor. And so we see that we have a simple supply and demand explanation. So if I draw a supply and demand curve, there'll be no equations, but there are a couple of graphs. You see there I've just drawn a relative supply of and demand for skilled workers relative to unskilled workers. So these are ratios. And equally on the vertical axis is the wage. It shows you the wage of skilled workers relative to the wage of unskilled workers. That's the premium, or what you earn extra for being, say, university educated. And the story is that there's a supply and there's a demand, and the demand is shifting out, and with that, as it shifts out, the wage premium is going to rise. And so this will happen if it goes up like this. We're moving up, and so we're seeing the wage distribution widening. And indeed, the wage distribution has widened. To show you yet another of my train wreck graphs, this shows you a graph for what's happening to individual earnings. So we're going back now, not talking about household incomes, but talking about what you individually, each of you, are earning. And it shows you the earnings of the top group, the top 10% point, the top decile point, as a percentage of the median. So, for example, the 200 on the axis means that a person 10% from the top is earning twice as much as a person in the middle. And you can see that throughout this period, with the exception, I think, of France, that ratio has been going up in the period since the 1970s. The top earners have been moving away from the person in the middle. So we seem to have, on the one hand, an economic theory, supply and demand, technology and globalization, and on the other hand, it does appear that the wage distribution was indeed changing. So it all sounds like we do have a story. But, and this is really one of the things I want most to get across, there are some important buts. The standard textbook story, I think, is misleading. But we need to do three things. We need, first of all, to take a longer-term view than the one I took in that slide. I'll explain why in a moment. We need, I'm afraid, to do a little more than first-year economics and analyze the dynamics. And we need to look more carefully at the top. So let me look at these, if I may, in turn. First of all, just to show you the same graph I had just now, but with the whole picture. the whole picture going back to 1945. And this whole picture, I think, tells us three things. The first thing is that the rise in earnings dispersion, the top decile relative to the median, that rise didn't just start when Tinbergen was writing in 1970. In fact, in the United States, it started around about 1952. It's a much longer-term process. And it's a process that began before the forces I identified, technical change and globalization, started. And the most common explanation of technical change is information communication technologies, ICT. So people have been saying it's not surprising the top wages are rising because people with those skills are going to earn more. But of course in 1952, there were probably hardly any computers outside Harvard and Cambridge, England, and Manchester, I think. Clearly, the ICT revolution didn't start then, and yet you can see that in the United States particularly, but also in other countries, the United Kingdom, for example, and in France, the earnings distribution was widening. And 1952 was long before world trade began to expand in the way it has done recently. So the explanation of this has to be one which goes back further than the things which are currently being invoked. It also means that the 1950s and 60s were not such a golden age in another respect, which was that in those years we were actually seeing widening wage dispersion. And indeed, if you read the literature at the time, people were worrying about that. If you read the monthly labour review for the 1950s, you'll find people saying, what are we going to do about widening wage inequality? But the second thing you can see from this graph, or with this in conjunction with the earlier ones I presented, is that that increase in earnings inequality back then did not lead to a rise in household income inequality. That is, if you remember my graphs for the United States, for example, inequality was more or less flat throughout that period, the 50s and 60s. So what this tells us is another important thing, which is that you can have a rise in earnings dispersion that doesn't necessarily cause overall household income inequality. And it doesn't necessarily do it for the reasons that there may be other things that are working in the opposite direction. For example, it may be that it's limited by the effects of progressive taxation. Remember, we had tax rates then that went up to 50, 60, 70% in the 1950s and 60s. It went up higher than that, to 80%. It may have been offset also by other factors, particularly the fact that the welfare state was expanding, even in the United States. The old age and survivors insurance, for example, was clearly expanding at that time. So these two things aren't necessarily linked together. It's possible to have rising earnings dispersion without having rising income inequality. And then finally, you have to bear in mind that there have been periods in this graph when actually earnings dispersion fell. Not much in the United States, but certainly in France, United Kingdom, and Italy. It fell in the 1970s, late 1960s, 1970s. And again, we have to ask why. Well, one of the reasons why is that was a period of inflation, but it's also a period of incomes policies. A word which, or two words which you probably haven't heard for a long time, but incomes policies were, in the 1970s, a major part of macroeconomic and wider economic policy. And they, in many cases, had an equalizing effect. And in Britain, we had a maximum pay increase of £6 a week. You couldn't get a bigger pay increase than that. So that's not so long ago. In my memory, we did that. So I think there are some things which we need, therefore, to bear in mind, particularly when we come to policy, which will be my last section. But before that, I want to say something a bit more about the underlying theory, the underlying economics. I said that the explanation was essentially supply and demand, first year economics, Ec 101, as the Americans would call it. Well, unfortunately, you need a bit more than Ec 101. What Ec 101 tells you is you've got a supply curve and you've got a demand curve. So you've got that. That tells you that. It doesn't tell you anything about what will happen if one curve begins to move. It doesn't tell you that if the demand curve starts to move up, I'm trying to do it as far as my joints will allow me, but like that, what's going to happen? And of course, what will happen will partly depend. If it's just that, of course, then wages go up. But of course, it's likely that there will be some supply response as well. That is, the supply curve may move. So as the demand curve moves up, maybe the supply curve moves. So maybe both things are going on. And when you look at that and actually write down the mathematics as to how it will behave and sort of think about how the market might actually adjust, it turns out that actually the equilibrium of that process, what it will end up doing, is not going up and up and up all the way, but actually will level off. There'll still be an increase, but it will be a constant increase. The size of the increase will depend on the speed of adjustment. So the recommendations that Isabel and the Commission are making about investing in education as a means of coping with the problems with the labour market clearly will pay off, in the sense that the more you invest in spreading education, then the faster the supply curve will shift out, and with that, the smaller wage premium that will develop in that case. And that may explain why, for example, some countries, like the Nordic countries, have seen less increase than other countries. So this shows you that we have to think about the economic analysis a bit more fully and ask questions which are not simply saying supply and demand, and that's all. But if what I've said is right, you then might say to me, well, why then is it still going up? If you just told me it's not going to, it'll level off. And I think the answer to that is it's still going up because there's another part of the story, and that the action is now at the top of the scale rather than in terms of college education. And to illustrate this, I want to just take in detail, I think this is almost my last, if not my last graph, which is to look at my own country, the United Kingdom, and just look at slightly more detail at a picture which I've sort of described to you in general before. It's the same sort of picture as we had for the top decile earnings. So on the left-hand side, you've still got the 200 for twice median. But I've also put on there the bottom decile. That is, the people 10% up from the bottom, and their proportion to the median. So you'll see, for example, 50, 60, 65, and so on. That shows you that the bottom decile at the end had 55% on average of the median earnings. And then I divided the period into 4 phases. And you can see that the first phase, the distribution was spreading out at the top and the bottom. The top was going up, the bottom was going down. Then, as I said earlier, there was a period in the 60s when it narrowed. The top came down, the bottom went up. The bottom went up a lot, actually. That was equal pay and minimum wages and various other things in that time were very important. And then they started to widen out again. The third phase, top went up, the bottom went down. That was the 1980s. But now we have a different story. From 1989 to the present, 20-odd years, more than that, what we have is a story where the bottom did not fall relative to the median. It's remained remarkably stable over this period. 55%. It's the top that's been escaping. So what I'm arguing is that actually what we need to do is to explain the top. Now that requires some different economics. And I just want to sketch a little bit of this, because I think it is quite relevant and has implications for policy. I want to sketch what's now come to be called the superstar theory of pay. This is an idea which is popularized by Sherwin-Rosen, but he recognized, in fact, it's an idea that's been around for a long time. It's contained in Alfred Marshall's Principles of Economics, written in the 1890s. And the idea is a very simple one. I'll take an example. Suppose you consider footballers. Football. In the 1890s, football teams played in front of a crowd from their local town, basically, or city. And the money that got was from the money from people coming in, paying for tickets. They had a particular market they were selling to. And the next door town would have their own football club, so on. So you had Manchester United, you had Oxford United. People in Manchester went to see Manchester United, people in Oxford went to Oxford United. Then, of course, technology changed. Technology changed, so sitting in Oxford, I could hear from the radio the game being played in Manchester, and I might decide, therefore, to stay at home, listen to Manchester United on the radio, rather than go and watch Oxford. And through technology, radio, television, other media, clearly the spread of the better team, guess which, is able to be more extensive. Coupled, of course, with globalization. Manchester United has, I gather from Wikipedia, 325 million supporters in China. You know, that's 5 times the population of the United Kingdom. So what is happening is that people who are the best at what they're doing are able to extract more of the rent from this extra ability. The payments of these rents, the gradient becomes much steeper. And at the same time as the top gets up, the bottom lower down goes down. Now that's football example that's one version. Other people tell an opera singer version, which you can do as well. But I think the point is, of course, it's not just limited to performers. It's clearly also limited, it's not clearly, it also applies increasingly to institutions, given the fact that there's a second element, one which I'm sure people here are much better informed about than I am, which is the move towards individualisation of pay and the reduction in the extent of collective agreements about pay, obviously particularly at the upper end. So in the same way as I talked about Manchester United versus Oxford United, in the same way academics have now moved from being paid on essentially a scale for position. And when I first became a professor at the University of Essex, there were 4 points on the scale, and you moved up every 5 years from one point to the next. Now, I suspect there are probably 30 or 40 points. There are big differences opening up. So this has implications, clearly, for wage determination if what is happening is, on the one hand, the generation of considerably extra rents in many of these occupations, but also if they're now being determined in this kind of basis rather than through some kind of collective decision-making process. So that brings me to the final section on public action. What should we do in response to rising inequality? I put 2 different views on here. One is Ken Rogoff, former chief economist of the IMF, who says we should do nothing. He says that basically markets will deal with this. I put on the bottom Joe Stiglitz, former chief economist of the World Bank. He says that the government is part of the problem, and we certainly shouldn't do more of what they're doing. We should do something different. I think I have a third different view from either of those, although both of those can clearly be argued. My view is more that actually, on the whole, governments have done, not always, but in many cases, have taken actions that have reduced inequality. And part of the problem is that we've stopped doing it. This is something which the OECD, for example, has highlighted. It's highlighted the fact that actually the redistributive actions of governments are less strong and effective than they were in the past, and they say from the mid-1990s. If that's the case, and I think looking at individual countries, one can certainly see evidence of it, then we have to think about how the instruments that we used to use, like progressive income tax, not necessarily returning to 95% top tax rates, but certainly returning to the kind of tax rates we had in the 1920s, 30s, and so on. Thinking about differentiated indirect taxes with luxury rates of VAT, and thinking about restoring or making more effective wealth transfer taxes, inheritance taxes. We should think about action to make effective again the social safety nets. And I notice that, quoting again from the Davos speech, that Christine Lagarde says that we need policies such as a robust social safety net. Something which is clearly rather necessary. I owe to one of Isabel's colleagues, or to the Commission, the statistics which showed in a report, I think 2 years ago, that of the unemployed in Europe, those who've been unemployed for more than 6 months, 42% of them received no benefits, which is, I think, a staggering indictment of the effectiveness of the current social safety nets that we have, as is, of course, the fact we have 26 million people unemployed. Now this, you may say, well, that's fine, but why have we got where we are? We've got where we are because there are forces making this to be impossible. And those forces are, on the one hand, the impossibility of persuading voters to vote for it, and on the other hand, the fact that we can't act as single countries in a world where there's tax competition between different countries. Now, I think both of those may well be changing. I think it's very noticeable that there's a distinctly different attitude, to begin with regard to the payment of taxation. I think that a lot more could be done, but already politicians are beginning to say that tax avoidance, not just tax evasion, is unacceptable in the way it's been conducted, particularly by certain high wealth individuals and by corporations. Certain corporations, I should say, not universally. And this is, the reaction to this has been really quite striking. I think that in the same day as Mr. Cameron was declaring his intention of holding a referendum, he also, at the same time, was attacking international corporations for avoiding taxation. Now, that struck me as being slightly paradoxical because it seemed to me that one of the answers to the second problem, which is that of tax competition, is actually that the solution to that is going to lie through cooperation between countries, and that not just within the European Union, but globally, it seems to me that's the way we're going to go. And I think gradually we are seeing steps for various reasons, not just related to social justice, why countries are getting more willing to engage in collaboration over levying taxes effectively on people who at the moment are able to avoid or evade. I also think that we are beginning to see some movements towards some form of global tax regimes very slowly, but I think that's certainly a possibility. So I don't think that one should simply dismiss, as it were, going back to the instruments of redistribution that we've used in the past. But at the same time, I fully agree with those who say that we shouldn't just look at the redistributive impact of public policy. We need to look also at the determination of pre-redistribution incomes. And in the course of what I've been saying at various points, I've referred to, obviously, as I said, the role of educational policies and the demand for skilled workers, but I also draw attention to issues regarding pay determination and even possibly going back to thinking about various forms of incomes policies that we've had in the past. And I'd also say that it needs to be important not just to focus on earned incomes, but the capital income side of the equation, something I've not, I'm afraid, said much about, but one which is certainly of substantial and increasing importance with the rise in the share of profits in national income in many countries. The issues that there are with regard to the ownership of capital and its role in our economies is something that we need very much, I think, to bear in mind when thinking about the policy agenda. So, to sum up, I think there are indeed reasons for concern. The upper part of the distribution does seem to be, in quite a number of countries, although to differing extents, does seem to be racing away. That the way in which in the 1950s and 60s we held in check the effect of rising earnings dispersion doesn't seem to be true today, because we've tended to scale back the way in which we redistribute, and because we've not had the redistribution of capital income that took place at that time. So I think there are real reasons why we need to be thinking hard about this issue. There are, though, some grounds for optimism. I don't think it's clear that we're going really all the way up at the moment, in the sense that we seem to be plateauing in quite a number of cases, and it's only in 2 of the countries I looked at where we're actually seeing significant increases in the last 10 years or so. There have been periods in the past when we have succeeded in reducing inequality, and there are measures that can be taken. Now, I also read in the newspaper, as you can see, Eurostar allows you plenty of time these days to catch up on the newspapers. And I also read an account of the lessons from Obama's inaugural address for managers about how to make speeches. And I looked at this and I say, the first rule was, do not use PowerPoint. So I failed that. The second reason was you should look at your audience. I hope I've looked most of you in the eye. And the third reason was to know what you're talking about. And then I'll leave you to judge, not to me.